There are few crimes more morally repugnant than stealing from vulnerable children. Every dollar stolen is a meal not eaten, a doctor's visit missed, and a future diminished. Child welfare fraud plunders our children's potential and erodes our nation's future. And disturbingly, at the start of this new year, America has learned that this kind of looting was not occurring in some distant or lawless place, but in the heart of America's Midwest. Federal prosecutors in Minnesota now estimate that half or more of the $18 billion spent since 2018 across 14 Minnesota welfare programs may have been lost to fraud. If confirmed, the amount stolen would rank among the largest welfare frauds in American history. In Minnesota, a welfare system designed to uplift the most vulnerable children was treated like an open ATM, exploiting both taxpayers and the public trust extended to immigrant communities. Over the last decade, Minnesota Democrats didn't just fail to stop the fraud. They made it easy and profitable, and in a totally lawless fashion, silenced anyone who pointed it out. Taken together, the record shows that the fraud was not accidental or unforeseeable, but was the product of deliberate inaction, willful blindness, and calculated abuse. Today, we will proceed in three parts. First, we will show that Minnesota was clearly warned by journalists, by auditors, and by its own independent oversight bodies, and that the state responded by passing laws and promulgating safeguards intending to stop this abuse. Secondly, we will examine how Minnesota's Democrat leadership deliberately turned a blind eye, failed to enforce those safeguards, and in some cases retaliated against those who tried to sound the alarm. And third, we will explain how the fraud actually took place, the mechanics by which these schemes operated, and the very real harms they inflicted, not only on taxpayers, but on vulnerable children and on law-abiding Somali families whose trusts and identities were exploited. First, Minnesota was warned. Let me be clear about one foundational fact. Minnesota was not caught unaware. Minnesota was warned repeatedly, unmistakably, and years in advance. This fraud did not arrive suddenly. It did not emerge from an unforeseen loophole, and it did not occur without notice. As far back as 2010, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel exposed widespread child care fraud across the upper Midwest in a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigation that sent a clear warning to regulators, providers, and the child care industry as a whole. Without strong oversight and verification, fraud would flourish. Minnesota was on notice. Nearly a decade later, those warnings were no longer journalistic. Now, they were official. In 2019, the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor issued a formal report examining Minnesota's Child Care Assistant Program, the CCAP. The Legislative Auditor identified serious deficiencies in oversight, including inadequate attendance verification, weak financial controls, fragmented enforcement, and an over-reliance on provider self-reporting. The auditor warned plainly that these conditions created a high risk of fraud. Critically, the auditor estimated that approximately $100 million of Child Care Assistant Programs funds had already been lost to fraud. Minnesota Democrats responded, but not out of vigilance, out of political necessity. The report landed just months after they won their new majority in the state legislature in the 2018 elections. Faced with a damning audit and mounting political pressure, Democrats acted, on paper at least. Following the 2019 report, the legislature amended CCAP statutes and promulgated new enforcement policies designed to close precisely the gaps the auditor had identified. By 2019, Minnesota had the warnings, the audit findings, and a panoply of legal authorities to detect, stop, suspend, and prosecute fraud. But that brings us to the second part of the story. Democrat leadership ignored the law they had just passed, attacked whistleblowers, and failed to enforce it. Once Minnesota had been warned, and once Minnesota Democrats wrote the solution into law, the duty was clear: enforce the law. Instead, they treated legislation as a press release, not a mandate, providing political cover while allowing the money to keep flowing. Federal audits later confirmed what internal staff had warned all along. Minnesota failed to verify attendance, failed to use its suspension authority, and failed to intervene early when red flags appeared. What's worse, rather than go after the fraudsters, the state went after the whistleblowers. On January 31st, 2026, the Minnesota Star-Tribune reported that staff at the Minnesota Department of Human Services repeatedly flagged fraud risks and lax safeguards, only to have those concerns ignored, dismissed, or met with retaliation. According to that reporting, current and former DHS employees sent an anonymous letter to the U.S. House Committee on Oversight and Accountability describing serious and systemic failures dating back to at least 2019. Employees reported being reassigned, called racist and xenophobic, sidelined, excluded from key discussions, and in some cases subjected to what they described as threats or workplace surveillance after raising red flags. Minnesota's Democrat leaders did not reward integrity. Instead, they punished it. When bipartisan legislation was introduced to establish an independent inspector general, Minnesota Democrats blocked it. The Democrat House Speaker at the time explained why. An inspector general, quote, is not part of the budget framework, citing an $18 million cost over 4 years. As billions were being pilfered by fraud and as whistleblowers were being silenced and punished, Minnesota Democrats had the gall to say that an inspector general costing only $4.5 million a year was too expensive. That wasn't fiscal prudence, that was a choice. It was willful blindness. The programs move billions of dollars each year, and they're concentrated within a relatively small number of administrative pipelines. Minnesota's Somali community receives welfare benefits at rates far higher than the state average, making these programs both financially significant and politically sensitive. In a state where the two closest statewide elections were decided by less than 1%, the Somali community votes overwhelmingly Democrat. The numbers are stark. 81% of Somali households in Minnesota receive some form of welfare, 81%, compared to 21% of non-Somali households. 54% of Somali households receive food stamps compared to 7% of non-Somali households. 73% are enrolled in Medicaid compared to 18% of non-Somali households. And 27% receive cash assistance compared to 6% of non-Somali households. In December 2025, Minneapolis resident David Hoke, who's here today, accompanied by journalist Nick Shirley, visited child care centers, autism clinics, and healthcare facilities across Minneapolis. They went on a Tuesday, not a Saturday, not a holiday, not in the middle of the night. Tuesday during the day. What they found: blacked out windows, misspelled or non-existent signage. I will say we will always remember the Leering Center that promoted good leering. Multiple, quote, providers registered to the same address and no kids present. It's amazing having child care centers and autism centers with no kids. And by the way, it's not subtle. You walk up, there's no toys, there's no kids, and the windows are blacked out. This is not hidden. It is obvious, except for the Democrats that didn't want to see it. Had the state done its job, had it sent inspectors instead of press releases, that fraud would have been obvious. To understand just how calculated this fraud became, consider the most disturbing example of all. In September 2025, federal prosecutors charged Asha Farhan Hassan for orchestrating a $14 million fraud scheme against Minnesota's EIDBI autism program. The program exists to provide medically necessary early and intensive care to children with autism. Fraudsters turned it into a profit engine. According to the charges, Hassan and her partners recruited children from the Somali community, paid parents cash kickbacks, used unqualified individuals as quote-unquote therapists, and billed Medicaid for services never provided or grossly inflated. Where a child did not already have an autism diagnosis, the scheme allegedly worked to obtain one. In other words, there was no child they could not qualify because the diagnosis itself became the means to an end. According to the University of Minnesota, 1 in 12 8-year-old Somali children in Minnesota was diagnosed with autism, compared with 1 in 28 non-Somali children statewide. In Minnesota, Somali children are 7 times more likely than their non-Somali peers to receive autism quote-unquote treatment. These figures show extraordinary concentration and extraordinary billing, the precise conditions fraudsters exploit. And here's the deepest human cost. Telling an immigrant child that he has autism, not because he does, but because someone wants to get paid. Imagine the weight of that diagnosis on parents who may not speak English fluently, who trust authority, who believe the government would never lie about their child's health. That label can follow a child for life, shaping education, self-image, and opportunity. Doing that for financial enrichment is not merely fraud, it is the deliberate exploitation of children and the calculated betrayal of parents. And once fraud proceeds are laundered and sent overseas, in 2023, the Somali diaspora sent nearly $2 billion back to Somalia. Once they're sent overseas, they're effectively unrecoverable. Meanwhile, Al-Shabaab, the U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization and al-Qaeda's affiliate in Somalia, controls large swaths of territory and systematically extorts money moving through its financial channels. When billions of dollars are stolen from U.S. welfare programs and sent abroad, there is no credible way to ensure those funds do not enrich jihadists within Al-Shabaab. As one confidential source told the Manhattan Institute, the largest funder of Al-Shabaab, an Islamist terrorist organization in Somalia, is the Minnesota taxpayer. Listen to that again. The single largest funder of Al-Shabaab, a terrorist organization in Somalia, is the taxpayers of Minnesota. Taken together, the evidence before this committee leads to one unavoidable conclusion. Minnesota was warned. Minnesota's Democrat leadership failed to enforce the laws it passed, and that failure allowed organized fraud to flourish, harming children, betraying families, and robbing the public of trust and resources. This hearing is necessary because Minnesota's elected Democrats were complicit in this fraud. They stood to benefit politically from looking the other way as fraudsters robbed the taxpayers of Minnesota. Look at the bench of witnesses. To this hearing, I invited Governor Tim Walz. He's not here. I invited Attorney General Ellison. He's not here. I invited Mayor Fry and Tiki Brown, the commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Children, Youth, and Families. Not one of them agreed to testify and defend his or her conduct. They are hiding out after having served as the lookout in a bank robbery that was robbing the taxpayers of Minnesota. The people of Minnesota and the American people deserve better And not a one of these Democrats has given any credible excuse why they're terrified to answer questions.